The ice groans. It is a sound like no other on Earth, a deep, bone-shaking rumble that rises from beneath the frozen sea. In the perpetual twilight of the Arctic autumn, two ships lie trapped in the grip of pack ice that stretches unbroken to every horizon. The HMS Erebus and HMS Terror are prisoners now, held fast by walls of ice 20 feet thick. On the deck of Erebus, men move like ghosts through the gathering darkness. Their breath freezes instantly in the -40-degree air. Below decks, 129 souls wait in the belly of these wooden ships, surrounded by thousands of miles of ice and stone and death. They have been here for more than a year. The ships have not moved. The ice has not released them. Pause. It is September 1846. The expedition was supposed to conquer the Northwest Passage, the legendary route through the Arctic that had eluded explorers for centuries. Instead, these men are about to face something far worse than failure. What happened to them in the months and years that followed would become one of the greatest mysteries in exploration history. Why did every single man perish? What drove them to their final, desperate acts? And what dark secrets did the ice keep hidden for more than a century and a half? His name was Sir John Franklin, and in May of 1845, he was a man with everything to prove. At 59 years old, Franklin was considered past his prime by many in the British Admiralty. His previous Arctic expeditions had been marked by near disasters. He and his men had once been reduced to eating their own leather boots to survive, earning him the unfortunate nickname, the man who ate his boots. But Franklin was a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, a knight commander of the Royal Guelphic Order, and a man desperate for one final triumph to cement his legacy. The mission he was given seemed straightforward on paper. Sail through the Arctic archipelago north of Canada, navigate the uncharted waters of the Northwest Passage, and emerge victorious in the Pacific Ocean. It would be a feat no expedition had accomplished. It would make Franklin immortal. The British Admiralty spared no expense. They gave Franklin two ships that represented the absolute pinnacle of polar exploration technology. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were bomb vessels, warships built with reinforced hulls to withstand the recoil of heavy mortar. Their hulls had been further strengthened with layers of African oak and English elm. They were equipped with steam engines that could propel them at 4 knots, even without wind. The ships carried 3 years' worth of provisions, 33,000 pounds of tinned meat, 1,000 pounds of raisins, 580 gallons of pickles, nearly 5,000 gallons of alcohol, but most importantly, they carried hope. Franklin's crew was composed of experienced naval officers and seasoned sailors. His second-in-command was Captain Francis Crozier, an Irish officer who had more Arctic experience than Franklin himself. Crozier had served on multiple polar expeditions and understood the brutal realities of the frozen north. He had even proposed to a woman before the voyage. She had rejected him, choosing to wait for a man with better prospects. Crozier threw himself into the expedition with a broken heart and iron determination. Commander James Fitzjames, the third in command, was everything Crozier was not: young, handsome, aristocratic, and optimistic to the point of recklessness. At 33, he was eager for glory and completely confident in British superiority over nature itself. On May 19, 1845, the two ships departed from Greenhithe, England, to tremendous fanfare. Crowds lined the docks. Bands played, wives and children waved handkerchiefs. Franklin stood on the deck of Erebus, resplendent in his naval uniform, waving to the cheering masses. His wife, Lady Jane Franklin, watched from the shore with a mixture of pride and barely concealed dread. She had begged him not to go. He had insisted. They didn't know it yet, but it would be the last time anyone in England would see these men alive. The ships made their way north, stopping briefly in Greenland for final supplies and to send home a few sailors who had fallen ill. On July 26, 1845, Captain Dannett of the whaling ship Prince of Wales encountered Erebus and Terror moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay. He was invited aboard Erebus for dinner. Franklin was in excellent spirits, confident and jovial. The ships were well stocked, the men healthy and eager. Captain Dannett sailed away, looking back at the two ships as they prepared to enter Lancaster Sound, the gateway to the Arctic archipelago. It was the last confirmed sighting of Franklin and his men by European eyes. The ship sailed into the ice. The Arctic swallowed them whole. And for the next 3 years, the world heard nothing. Not a word, not a signal. Nothing but silence. Chapter 1. Into the ice. The first months proceeded according to plan. Franklin navigated Lancaster Sound and entered the maze of islands and channels that comprised the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The summer of 1845 was unusually warm. The ice was more open than it had been in years. This seemed like Providence. The ships made excellent progress, sailing west and then south down Peel Sound. According to Inuit testimony collected years later, the ships were seen by indigenous hunters during this period. The Inuit watched from shore as the two massive vessels, billowing black smoke from their steam engines, carved through the ice. They seemed invincible floating fortresses of wood and iron, but Franklin made a critical decision that summer. Instead of following the coastline where the ice was thinner, he chose to sail down the western side of King William Island, taking his ships into deep water. He believed this route would be faster. He was wrong. By September 1845, as the Arctic autumn descended, the ships became trapped in the pack ice northwest of King William Island. This was not unusual. Most Arctic expeditions expected to be frozen in for the winter. The ships were designed for it. The men settled in for a long, dark winter, confident that the ice would break up in the spring and they would complete their journey. They celebrated Christmas that year with theatrical performances, music, and carefully rationed extra portions of food and rum. Officers gave lectures on science and geography. The ships were warm, heated by steam from the engines. Outside, the temperature dropped to 50 below zero. The darkness was complete. The sun did not rise above the horizon from November through January, but they were British. They were disciplined. They were prepared, or so they believed. Chapter 2. The second winter-spring came. The ice did not break. Summer arrived, or what passes for summer in the high Arctic. Still, the ice held firm. The ships remained locked in place, surrounded by pressure ridges where the ice had buckled and heaved into frozen mountains. The crew must have stared out at this landscape of white on white, day after day, watching for leads of open water that never appeared. Morale began to fray. Captain Crozier, the experienced Arctic hand, surely recognized the danger they were in. The ships were trapped in the worst possible location far from land, in deep water where the multi-year pack ice was thickest and most stubborn. He had opposed this route from the beginning. Now his fears were being realized. The men maintained discipline, but cracks were beginning to show. Tempers flared over trivial matters. The monotony of shipboard life, the same faces, the same walls, the same routine ground at their spirits. Food remained plentiful, but fresh provisions were long gone. Everything came from tins now. Meat that had been sealed in containers years before, preserved by solder and sealed with lead. They didn't know it, but those tins were poisoning them. The solder used to seal the food containers was lead-based. Each meal leached microscopic amounts of the metal into their bodies. Lead accumulates in bones, in organs, in the brain. It causes fatigue, confusion, irritability, paranoia. It rots judgment and destroys decision-making. Slowly, invisibly, the expedition's leadership was being chemically compromised. But there were other problems too. Scurvy began to appear. Despite the pickles and preserved vegetables, the crew's vitamin C stores were depleting. Men's gums began to bleed. Old wounds reopened spontaneously. Lethargy set in. The ship's surgeon, Stephen Stanley, treated the cases with the medical knowledge of the era, which is to say, ineffectively. The Inuit knew that fresh meat prevented scurvy, but British naval doctrine insisted on tinned provisions and limited the hunting of seals and caribou. As the second winter approached in September 1846, the moment described in our opening, the situation was growing desperate. The ships had not moved for a full year. Provisions were being consumed steadily. The window for escape was closing. Chapter 3. The death of Franklin. Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847. We know this from a single document, a note recovered years later from a cairn on King William Island. The note was brief, scrawled in the margins of a standard Admiralty form. It stated simply, Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847. No cause was given, no details recorded. He was 61 years old. Historians have speculated endlessly about what killed him: heart attack, pneumonia, lead poisoning, scurvy, or perhaps simply the accumulated strain of 2 years in the ice, the weight of responsibility, the crushing realization that his final expedition, his chance at redemption, had become a disaster. Whatever the cause, his death marked a turning point. Command of the expedition fell to Captain Francis Crozier, the experienced, pragmatic Irishman who had warned against this route from the beginning. If anyone could save these men, it was Crozier, but the situation was beyond saving. By the summer of 1847, the crew had been trapped for nearly 2 years. The ice showed no sign of releasing them. Food stores, calculated for 3 years, were now 2/3 depleted. Scurvy was spreading. The lead poisoning, though unrecognized, was affecting decision-making throughout the chain of command. Men were dying. Crozier faced an impossible choice: stay with the ships and hope for a miraculous breakup of the ice, or abandon the vessels and attempt to reach civilization on foot. Chapter 4. The decision to abandon on April 22, 1848. Captain Francis Crozier made the decision that would seal the fate of every remaining man. They would abandon the ships. According to the note found in the cairn, the expedition had suffered 24 deaths by this point, including Franklin and 8 other officers. 105 men remained alive. The ships had been locked in ice for 2 years and 8 months without moving. Provisions were running dangerously low. The nearest outpost of European civilization was Fort Resolution, more than 1,000 miles to the south. Crozier's plan was to march south across the ice to the Canadian mainland, then follow the back river inland to a Hudson's Bay Company trading post. It was a distance of roughly 400 miles across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, but staying with the ships meant certain death. The crew began preparations. They constructed sledges to haul their supplies across the ice. And here, Crozier made a series of decisions that have baffled historians ever since. Instead of taking only essential survival, gear, food, medicine, weapons, tents, the men loaded their sledges with silverware, with leather-bound books, with silk handkerchiefs and button polish, with heavy ceramic plates and sterling silver serving dishes. Some sledges, when later discovered, weighed more than 700 pounds, far too heavy for men weakened by starvation and scurvy to pull effectively. Why? Was it British propriety taken to suicidal extremes? The belief that one must maintain civilization even at the gates of death? Was it the lead poisoning affecting judgment? Or was it a desperate attempt to maintain morale by pretending this was merely a temporary inconvenience, not a death march? We will never know. What we do know is that on April 22, 1848, 105 men filed off the ships and onto the ice. They formed a long, struggling column stretching across the frozen sea. Behind them, Erebus and Terror sat silent and empty, abandoned to the Arctic. The ships would not be seen again for 166 years. Chapter 5. The Death March. The Inuit saw them. Native hunters and families living on King William Island encountered the strange column of white men struggling across the ice. The Inuit had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. They knew how to survive in this environment. They wore furs, ate fresh seal and caribou meat, built snow houses, traveled light and fast. The British did none of these things. Inuit oral testimony, collected in the decades that followed, paints a haunting picture. The white men were hauling impossibly heavy sledges across the ice. They were starving, their faces gaunt, their movements slow and confused. They wore wool uniforms that provided inadequate protection against the cold. Some had already gone blind from snow and scurvy. The Inuit tried to help. They gestured toward seals, offering to teach the strangers how to hunt. The British refused or didn't understand. They continued their march, dragging their sledges loaded with silverware and books, trudging toward death. According to Inuit accounts, the men were beginning to fall. Some collapsed on the ice and were left behind by their companions. Others wandered off alone into the white wasteland. Bodies began to mark the route of their march, dark shapes scattered across the endless white. Chapter 6. The final horror. What happened next is the darkest part of the Franklin story. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. The survivors resorted to cannibalism. Bones recovered from Franklin expedition sites show clear marks of defleshing, careful, methodical cuts made with knives to remove muscle tissue. Skulls were cracked open to access the brain. Long bones were split to extract marrow. This was not predation by animals. This was human beings consuming other human beings in a desperate attempt to survive. For decades, the British establishment denied this evidence. It was unthinkable, impossible, that officers of Her Majesty's Royal Navy would engage in such barbarism. Inuit testimony describing cannibalism was dismissed as savage lies, but the physical evidence cannot be disputed. We must be clear about what this means. These were not monsters. These were ordinary men pushed beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. Starving, delirious with scurvy and lead poisoning, watching their companions die one by one in the frozen wasteland, they made the choice that some humans make when faced with extinction. They fed on the dead to sustain the living. It did not save them. The scattered remains tell the story of complete collapse. Small groups of men separated from the main body, staggering in different directions. Some tried to return to the ship. Several bodies were found heading north, back the way they had come, as if seeking shelter they had abandoned. Others continued south, though by this point they were too weak to make meaningful progress. One group of perhaps 30 men made it as far as Terror Bay on the southern coast of King William Island. They collapsed there, too exhausted to continue. Their bodies were found years later, scattered among the rocks. Another group reached a place now called Starvation Cove on the mainland. They got within sight of their goal, the back river that might have led them to salvation. But they had nothing left. No strength, no food, no hope. They died there, within 100 miles of Hudson's Bay Company territory. Captain Francis Crozier, the experienced Arctic hand who had warned against this voyage, who had taken command after Franklin's death, who had made the agonizing decision to abandon the ships, his body was never identified. He vanished into the Arctic like all the others. Some Inuit testimony suggests he may have survived longer than most, that he was seen with a small group of survivors attempting to reach civilization. But if he did survive longer, it only meant he suffered longer. Not a single man made it out alive. The silence from the Arctic stretched from months into years. By 1848, concerned whispers were beginning in London. By 1850, those whispers had become alarm. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's widow, mounted an aggressive campaign demanding the Admiralty send search expeditions. She spent her entire fortune funding rescue attempts. She lobbied Parliament. She wrote letters to newspapers. She became a national figure, the devoted wife who would not abandon hope. The Admiralty, embarrassed and increasingly concerned, launched the largest search operation in naval history. Between 1848 and 1859, more than 40 expeditions were sent into the Arctic to find Franklin and his men. Ships searched every channel, every bay, every island. They found almost nothing. In 1850, the first graves were discovered on Beechey Island. 3 crew members who had died during the first winter, buried in the permafrost with careful markers. But of the ships and the 126 other men, there was no sign. In 1854, Dr. John Ray of the Hudson Bay Company encountered Inuit near Pelly Bay, who possessed items from the Franklin expedition silverware engraved with officers' initials, gold watches, naval buttons. The Inuit told Ray that white men had been seen starving on King William Island years before. They told him about finding bodies and evidence of cannibalism. Ray brought this information back to London. The reaction was immediate and vicious. How dare he suggest British naval officers had resorted to such savagery? How dare he trust the word of Esquimau over the honor of English gentlemen? Ray was vilified in the press. Charles Dickens wrote editorials defending the expedition's honor and attacking Inuit credibility. The Victorian establishment would not accept the truth. But the truth had a way of emerging. In 1859, Captain Francis Leopold McClintock led an expedition that discovered the final note, the message left in a cairn on King William Island describing Franklin's death and the decision to abandon ship. McClintock's team also found a ship's boat mounted on a sledge, pointing back toward the ships. Inside the boat were 2 skeletons and that bizarre cargo of luxury items, silk handkerchiefs, soap, slippers, books. A boat prepared for an afternoon's recreation, not a desperate march for survival. More remains were discovered over the following decades, bones scattered across King William Island, abandoned campsites, discarded equipment. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, but the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. The ships themselves, Erebus and Terror, had vanished completely. They became ghost ships, phantom vessels that had sailed into legend. The mystery deepens. For more than a century and a half, the Franklin expedition remained one of exploration's greatest mysteries. What exactly had killed Franklin? Where had the ships finally sunk? What had happened during those final months? Why had experienced officers made such catastrophically poor decisions? Modern science has provided some answers. Analysis of remains recovered from Beachy Island revealed dangerously high levels of lead, evidence of the poisoning from tinned food. This explains some of the bizarre decision-making, the overloaded sledges, the refusal of Inuit help, the choice to wear wool instead of fur. But the ships remained lost, their exact fate unknown. Until 2014, in September of that year, Canadian researchers using underwater sonar located a wreck in the waters off King William Island. It was HMS Erebus, sitting upright on the seafloor in just 11 meters of water, remarkably well preserved. 2 years later, in 2016, Terror was found in Terror Bay, also upright, also intact. 45 miles from where the note said the ships had been abandoned. This discovery raised new questions. Both ships were found well south of where they were supposed to be. Terror was in a protected bay, not crushed in the ice. Evidence suggests someone had sailed or drifted the ships after the initial abandonment. Had a skeleton crew returned to the vessels? Had the ships broken free of the ice and drifted unmanned? The mystery, even now, is not fully solved. The Franklin expedition cost 129 lives and achieved nothing. The ships never traversed the Northwest Passage. The route they died attempting to navigate proved to be impassable by sailing vessels even today. It is one of the most ice-choked waterways in the Arctic. Roald Amundsen would eventually complete the passage in 1906, but by a different route in a smaller ship, with a small crew who learned from the Inuit instead of ignoring them. But the expedition's failure was not meaningless. The decades of search efforts that followed mapped vast regions of the Arctic that had been unknown to European cartographers. The search expeditions themselves contributed more to geographic knowledge than Franklin's voyage ever could have. In a strange way, the expedition accomplished more in death than it ever would have in success. Lady Jane Franklin never remarried. She spent the rest of her life defending her husband's reputation and pushing for memorials. She died in 1875 at age 83, still believing John Franklin was a hero who had died in the service of his nation. Perhaps she was right? The line between hero and victim is often thinner than we imagine. Today, memorials to the Franklin expedition can be found across Britain and Canada. The graves on Beachy Island are protected historic sites. The wrecks of Erebus and Terror are being carefully explored by archaeologists, revealing new details with each dive. The story is still being written. But the true memorial is the story itself, the tale of men who sailed into the unknown, who faced impossible circumstances, who made terrible decisions and paid the ultimate price. It is a story about the limits of technology, the dangers of hubris, and the brutal indifference of nature to human ambition. The Arctic keeps its secrets longer than anywhere else on Earth. The ice preserves, the cold mummifies. And sometimes, after more than a century, the frozen North gives back what it has taken. Not the men themselves, but fragments of their story, pieces of the truth. The Franklin expedition reminds us that the wilderness does not care about our courage. It does not respect our preparation or admire our determination. It simply exists, vast and cold and patient, waiting for us to make a mistake. Every man who sailed with Franklin made a choice to venture into that wilderness. They chose glory over safety, discovery over comfort, legacy over life, and the Arctic granted them immortality of a kind not the heroic triumph they sought, but something darker and more enduring. They became a mystery, a ghost story, a warning. The ice groans, the wind howls, and somewhere beneath the dark waters of the Arctic, two ships sit in eternal silence, monuments to ambition and folly, to courage and tragedy, to the thin line between exploration and extinction. If you found this story compelling, there are many more forgotten tales of survival and tragedy waiting to be told. The polar regions alone hold dozens of such stories, expeditions that vanished, ships that were crushed, and men who challenged nature and lost. Each one carries lessons about human nature, about our capacity for endurance, and about the sometimes terrible cost of pushing beyond our limits. The Franklin expedition is not just history. It is a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting our ambition, our pride, our courage, and our fragility. And in that reflection we see ourselves.